Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the channel. The video opens with a striking question delivered over a backdrop of dramatic music and slow-motion visuals. Mist rising over rugged terrain, vintage Canadian flags rippling in the wind, and black and white maps flickering to life with old borderlines. A voice cuts through. What if I told you that Canada once invaded itself? The tension is immediate. Most people think of Canada as peaceful, stable, even uneventful, but that wasn't always the case. The narrator continues, teasing what's to come. Long before Canada became the calm, unified nation we know today, it was a land of sharp divisions between English and French, settlers and Indigenous peoples, and even between regions vying for power. From internal rebellions to provinces clashing with federal forces, Canada has faced its own civil storms. As the narration builds, we see fast cuts of reenactments, redcoats marching through narrow valleys, rebels raising muskets, and parchment orders signed under candlelight. A zoom into a spinning globe halts on 19th century Canada, setting the stage. The teaser ends with, "This is the story of when Canada turned on itself, through fire, fear, and fractured loyalties." Viewers are left on edge, curious to learn about the forgotten chapters of Canada's internal conflicts. In the decades following Confederation in 1867, Canada was far from the unified, peaceful nation we often imagine today. The early years of the Dominion were marked by deep fractures, cultural, political, and geographic. The newly formed country brought together Ontario, Quebec, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia under a single federal system, but unity was more theoretical than actual. Each region carried its own priorities, grievances, and, in some cases, outright hostility towards central authority. One of the most persistent and visible divides was between English-speaking and French-speaking Canadians. In Quebec, where French language and Catholic identity were central to the population's cultural survival, many viewed Confederation with suspicion. They feared domination by English Protestant elites and a loss of autonomy. This fear would grow into full-fledged nationalist movements in the 20th century, but its seeds were planted early. Meanwhile, Indigenous resistance simmered across the prairies. As the government pushed westward, it often ignored treaties and marginalized Métis and First Nations communities. This led to flashpoints like the Red River Rebellion of 1869-70, led by Louis Riel, who fought to defend Métis land and rights as Canada annexed Rupert's Land. Just over a decade later, the Northwest Rebellion of 1885 saw Riel return, this time facing off against Canadian troops in a bloody clash that would end in his controversial execution. His death divided the nation, with many in Quebec viewing him as a martyr and symbol of resistance against Anglo-Canadian dominance. At the same time, western provinces like Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta grew increasingly frustrated with a federal government that seemed to prioritize central Canada's interests. This resentment, later known as Western alienation, was rooted in policies that controlled grain prices, transportation, and trade in ways that disadvantaged the West. Out east, maritime provinces felt similarly neglected. Nova Scotia, in particular, had serious misgivings about joining Confederation and even flirted with the idea of secession in the years immediately following. These early tensions made it clear that Canada's unity was fragile, built on uneasy compromises and power struggles. Beneath the surface of the map lay deep fractures between language, culture, and geography that would periodically erupt into open resistance. This wasn't just political disagreement. In some cases, it was armed defiance. By the late 19th century, the fractures within Canada turned violent, twice. The Métis, a distinct people of mixed Indigenous and European ancestry, found themselves increasingly threatened as Canadian expansion pushed westward. The government's disregard for Métis land rights, culture, and political voice sparked what would become known as the Riel Rebellions, two uprisings that challenged Canadian authority from within and led to military action against Canadian citizens by their own government. The first uprising, the Red River Rebellion of 1869-70, began when the Dominion of Canada acquired Rupert's Land from the Hudson's Bay Company without consulting its inhabitants. The Métis of the Red River settlement, modern-day Winnipeg, feared the loss of their land and way of life. In response, Louis Riel, a young, charismatic Métis leader, formed a provisional government to negotiate terms for entry into Confederation. Though bloodshed was minimal, the act was seen as a direct challenge to Ottawa's authority. Riel's resistance forced the government to acknowledge Métis concerns, resulting in the creation of Manitoba as a province with specific protections for Métis people. Still, Riel fled into exile, branded a traitor by many in English Canada. 15. Years later, tensions reignited. The Northwest Rebellion of 1885 was far more violent. Riel returned from exile, this time rallying Métis and some First Nations allies in present-day Saskatchewan. They were once again protesting land dispossession and the federal government's neglect of Western communities. What followed was an armed conflict between the Métis and a Canadian military force dispatched by Prime Minister John A. Macdonald. It was one of the first uses of the newly completed Canadian Pacific Railway to mobilize troops rapidly across the country. The rebellion ended in defeat at the Battle of Batoche. Riel was captured, tried for treason, and executed by hanging in November 1885. His death ignited a political firestorm. In English-speaking Canada, Riel was largely seen as a rebel who threatened national unity. But in French-speaking Quebec, he was hailed as a hero who stood up for minority rights and cultural survival. The execution deepened the rift between English and French Canada and sparked a surge in Quebec nationalism that would echo for generations. These uprisings weren't simply regional protests, they were acts of defiance from within, with Canada, sending armed forces against its own people. They exposed the growing pains of a young nation, struggling to balance control with representation, expansion with justice. And at the center of it all was Louis Riel, both rebel and visionary, whose legacy still divides and inspires to this day. In the fall of 1970, Canada faced one of its most dramatic internal confrontations, not on distant battlefields, but in the streets of Montreal. The October Crisis marked the only time in Canadian history when martial law was declared during peacetime. At the center of the storm was a radical separatist group known as the Front de Libération du Québec, or FLQ, whose violent tactics pushed the country to the brink of civil breakdown. The FLQ had been active for nearly a decade, using bombings and robberies to advance their goal: an independent socialist Quebec, free from what they saw as English-Canadian colonialism. But in October 1970, they escalated their campaign dramatically. First, they kidnapped British diplomat James Cross, demanding the release of imprisoned FLQ members. Days later, they abducted Quebec Labour Minister Pierre Laporte, plunging the Gauze province into panic. The federal government, led by Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau, responded with unprecedented force. Citing the need to protect national security, Trudeau invoked the War Measures Act, a sweeping piece of legislation that suspended civil liberties, allowed arrests without warrants, and sent tanks and troops into the streets of Montreal. Over 3,000 soldiers were deployed. More than 400 people were arrested, many without charge, including artists, academics, and activists, loosely connected to Quebec's nationalist movement. When asked by reporters how far he was willing to go, Trudeau famously replied, "Just watch me." The phrase became iconic, symbolizing his firm stance against terrorism, but also sparking fierce debate about government overreach and the militarization of domestic politics. The crisis took a tragic turn when Laporte's body was found in the trunk of a car. He had been murdered by his captors. James Cross, however, was eventually released after negotiations and safe passage for his kidnappers to Cuba. The October crisis left Canadians asking hard questions. Did Canada, in effect, invade Quebec? Supporters of Trudeau's actions argued that the nation faced an existential threat and decisive action was necessary to preserve democracy. But critics, especially in Quebec, viewed the military response as an overreaction that trampled civil liberties and inflamed separatist sentiment. The crackdown arguably deepened the divide between French and English Canada and gave new energy to the Quebec sovereignty movement. In hindsight, the October crisis remains one of the most controversial episodes in Canadian history. It revealed just how fragile national unity could be and how quickly peace could give way to the spectacle of soldiers patrolling city streets, not to defend against a foreign enemy, but to confront unrest at home. In the summer of 1990, Canada once again saw its military face off, not against a foreign adversary, but against its own people. The Oka crisis was a tense and emotional 78-day standoff between Mohawk land defenders and the Canadian government, centered around a dispute that went far beyond a patch of forest. It was about sovereignty, history, and the unfulfilled promises of reconciliation. The conflict began in Oka, Quebec, when the town approved the expansion of a private golf course onto land that included a sacred Mohawk burial ground. The Mohawk of Kanesatake, whose claims to the land had been ignored for over 2 centuries, erected a barricade to block access. They were soon joined by Mohawk warriors from the nearby Kanawake and Akwesasne communities. To them, this was not just about trees or graves. It was about protecting their rights, their dead, and their nationhood. On July 11th, Quebec's provincial police, SQ, attempted to dismantle the barricade in a pre-dawn raid. A gunfight broke out. Officer Marcel Lemay was killed and tensions escalated rapidly. In response, the Mohawk built additional blockades, including one that shut down a major highway and bridge. The standoff captured national and international attention. In a controversial move, the federal government, led by Prime Minister Brian Mulroney, deployed over 2,500 soldiers from the Canadian Armed Forces to surround and contain the Mohawk defenders. The sight of armed soldiers facing Indigenous men, women, and children behind barricades sent shockwaves across the country. Helicopters circled. Armored vehicles rolled in. It looked like a war zone on sovereign Indigenous land. The standoff dragged on through the summer, marked by negotiations, tense standoffs, and media scrutiny. Despite the presence of weapons on both sides, large-scale violence was narrowly avoided. Eventually, the warriors laid down their arms and the crisis ended peacefully, but the core issues remained unresolved. The Oka crisis became a symbol of centuries of broken treaties and ignored land claims. It also raised a profound question. Can a government claim to support reconciliation while using military force to suppress Indigenous resistance? For many, Oka was an internal military conflict that exposed the deep colonial structures still embedded in Canadian society. In the years since, Oka has become a rallying point for Indigenous rights movements across the country. It forced Canadians to reckon with the uncomfortable truth that the nation's history includes not only peaceful diplomacy, but also armed standoffs on stolen land. The echoes of Oka still resonate in conflicts over pipelines, land defense, and sovereignty today. In the western provinces of Alberta and Saskatchewan, a different kind of internal crisis has been brewing, not one of armed conflict, but of deep political alienation. For decades, many in the West have felt that Ottawa ignores their voices, exploits their resources, and imposes decisions that hurt their economies. This long-standing frustration has given rise to a powerful sentiment, Western alienation, and in recent years, it's even taken on a separatist edge. At the heart of the tension is the perception that federal policies are shaped by and for central Canada, particularly Ontario and Quebec. This has been especially acute in energy-producing provinces like Alberta and Saskatchewan, where industries such as oil and gas are vital to the local economy but increasingly at odds with federal climate policies. The carbon tax, pipeline delays, and regulatory hurdles have fueled resentment, with many Westerners feeling they are being sacrificed for the sake of urban environmental politics. This discontent boiled over after the 2019 federal election, in which the governing Liberal Party won no seats in Alberta or Saskatchewan. In the aftermath, the term Wexit, a play on Brexit, gained momentum. Though initially dismissed by many as fringe rhetoric, the idea of Western separation began gaining real traction. Political groups and parties advocating for Western independence emerged, and polls showed that a significant portion of the population was at least open to the idea of breaking away from Canada. While Wexit has not resulted in physical confrontation, its symbolism is potent. It reflects a growing sense that Canada is not one nation, but several regions with competing interests and visions of the future. The divide is not just economic, but cultural and political. Many in the West view federal leadership as out of touch, while the rest of Canada often sees Western grievances as overblown or parochial. This internal division doesn't involve soldiers or barricades, but it does represent a threat to national unity. It raises hard questions about fairness, federalism, and what it means to be Canadian in a country so geographically vast and politically diverse. The Wexit movement is a reminder that even without war or rebellion, a country can still be torn from within, not by force, but by disillusionment and drift. Canada is often seen as a peaceful, stable country, quietly polite, diplomatically cautious, and free of the internal strife that has shaped other nations. But a closer look at its history tells a more complex story. From armed standoffs with Indigenous peoples to military interventions in Quebec and political fractures in the West, Canada has repeatedly grappled with internal conflicts that have tested the fabric of its identity. These moments matter, not just as historical footnotes, but as defining episodes in Canada's nation-building journey. They reveal the tensions between unity and diversity, between centralized authority and regional autonomy, between reconciliation and repression. Each internal crisis has forced Canada to confront uncomfortable questions. When does protection become control? When does governance begin to look like occupation? Whether it was soldiers deployed against the Mohawk Nation at Oka, tanks rolling into Montreal during the October crisis, or political movements in Alberta threatening to walk away from the Federation, Canada's leaders have often walked a fine line between maintaining order and asserting dominance. And those on the receiving end, be they Métis, Mohawk, Quebecois, or Westerners, have often viewed the government's actions not as protection, but as invasion. In this way, Canada's story echoes broader patterns seen around the world. The U.S. Civil War, Spain's Catalonia crisis, the U.K.'s troubles in Northern Ireland, all illustrate how internal divisions can shape, strain, or even break nations. What sets Canada apart is not the absence of such tensions, but its ongoing struggle to manage them without falling apart. These chapters in Canadian history, violent rebellions, military deployments, political estrangement, aren't just stories of conflict. They're also stories of endurance, of negotiation, and of evolving identity. They've shaped how Canada sees itself and how its people understand concepts like justice, sovereignty, and belonging. Understanding these internal conflicts doesn't diminish Canada's reputation, it deepens it. It reveals a nation that, like all others, has had to earn its unity, sometimes painfully, always imperfectly. And as today's debates about Indigenous rights, Quebec identity, and Western alienation continue, this history reminds us that a country is not just a map, it's a conversation, often a tense one, between the people who call it home. Canada's history is often framed around peacekeeping abroad, but as we've seen, some of its most dramatic confrontations happened within its own borders. From the Riel rebellions, where Métis citizens took up arms to defend their land and culture, to the October crisis, when tanks rolled through Montreal, to the Oka standoff, where Indigenous land protectors faced down a military force, and even to the simmering discontent of Western alienation, which threatens to fracture the Federation without a single shot fired. These are stories of a nation grappling with itself. So, did Canada really invade itself? Maybe not in the traditional sense. But in many of these moments, citizens, often marginalized, found themselves on the other side of government force, treated not as participants in a democracy, but as threats to it. These weren't just law enforcement actions. They were expressions of power that left deep scars and raised lasting questions. Now we want to hear from you. Do you think these events count as internal invasions? How should we remember them, and what can they teach us about today's Canada? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if you found this deep dive into Canada's hidden history compelling, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more stories that textbooks too often leave out. This has been History Revealed, where we uncover the truths that shape the past and still echo into the present.